Hey, how are you?
All right, I think we'll get started because we've got quite a few presenters to get through. So this is really geared towards ideas, trying to get ideas out to the residents in particular, and seeing if as we broadcast what we do, if it'll generate new ideas, new help, some potentials for collaboration in the future. So we're going to have, I think, 6 or 7 folks that'll be presenting briefly about what they're currently doing, future directions, and possibly where they anticipate help being needed, either through residents or even other individuals or even other faculty. So for me, I've tapered down my active clinical trials. There's a few trials that we're in the process of hopefully getting to press soon. So the ones that I have been focusing on lately is the predicate MRI. So an MRI before an injection, and if that helps decision making, and hopefully that'll get to press shortly. Adele's helping me with that. The hot radic study is something we did for about 5 years, where we followed people's strength after an acute radiculopathy and looked at other secondary measures as well, but strength was the main one. And we collected about 40 individuals in that study that had about 5 touch points each. So there's a lot of data. And some promising stuff. The biggest issue was there was some incomplete data sets, so I submitted it once. It didn't get a favorable review, so I'm submitting it to a different journal. But it does have a lot of other potential. For example, if MRI's features predict outcome of strength. So we have a sub-analysis on MRI features, but there could be all kinds of other sub-analyses. The LESS trial, that's the spinal stenosis injection trial. We were part of a multi-center trial with the initial publication in 2014 in New England Journal of Medicine. That's led to lots of data as well. The primary one that I've been focused on is steroid suppression. And we have a paper that's going to be in Spine in a few months based on the steroid suppression data. The other things that I've been involved with over the last couple of years is this Medicare data set. So I've been working with some colleagues at the NIH Clinical Center, and they have access to the 100% Medicare data set, and that's allowed us to track outcomes, complications from injections in particular. But that data set is pretty robust. It needs big computers. You have to run fake data first to see if your models are right before you run the 100% data set. But that has a lot of potential for other things. We did one study on health disparity. So people with certain racial background got less treatment, surgical treatment for spine conditions than Caucasians, for example. So there's a lot to potentially analyze. And then kind of the thing that's probably not quite research but more process improvement is changing our healthcare delivery model for spine, trying to have the value stream be shorter so they get to evidence-based care like PT much quicker than we're currently delivering. We're potentially going to try some things with telemedicine soon. I'm trying to work on some shared decision-making models, potentially with some machine learning capability. So those are the things that I've currently working on. I just wanted to show a couple projects that that residents or fellows worked on that I thought worked out really well. So Erin Maslowski was a resident in Marshall Emmig's class. A while ago, she had an idea. She had the idea early on, I think her PGY2 year. She submitted the IRB with some help. Then a bunch of us recruited the patients, and it was a very straightforward study, pre and post injection maneuvers. And then it took a while to get to publication. So after she collected the data and presented it at Gersten Day, I think it took her one more year to get it to publication. And actually, Jerry helped us with the stats on that one. That was very successful. It's an example of how a resident with their own idea, with the right people involved, can get something to the end. But it's a 3-year process to get it to publication. Zach Abbott was one of our fellows now about 7 years ago. So he just had 1 year here, but I had this idea of trying to figure out if there was bad apples with injection utilization. So we used this database that's from commercial insurance that the pharmacy school has a license for, and using that data, he was able to present it at Gersten Day, and then he could have actually published it sooner, but we put it in for an outstanding paper, so that usually takes more time and eventual publication, but we got an outstanding paper award through the Spine Journal. So a couple examples of how trainees can really get things done. As far as future directions, I'll be brief. I already talked about the shared decision-making model for different aspects of spine care. There's some analysis that could be done. There's a few people with spinal stenosis that kind of almost spontaneously get better with doing just a couple things, figuring out who those people are, because usually it's a chronic condition. Trying to figure out the proper dose of medical treatment. So I think in PT that's one thing that's really come out is what should be the proper dose of exercise. Do you need to do it every day? Do you need to do it a certain amount of time, duration? So we haven't figured that out for spinal stenosis. There's lots of stuff that can be done on the steroid suppression thing. So we need to figure out what the total dose of steroid that's acceptable for a certain time period. So that's not really out there in the literature from anything more than just opinion. But I think we could figure some things out. A few other things. One thing that I've always been curious about is what's the difference between spinal stenosis, chronic nerve injury, and carpal tunnel syndrome, another chronic nerve injury? And how do their outcomes differ? Is there some pathophysiology that's happening that's making those two conditions different? And I'll end with the telespine stuff. So I've been trying to figure out a way to collaborate with this startup company, Telespine, that some of the PTs may know. So Mark Barnes is a PT out in the Boulder community, and he does this virtual PT, but he has an infrastructure for telemedicine. So is there a way that we can figure out virtual spinal stenosis treatment plans or triage? So if Medicaid patients are able to telemedicine in, can we get them into the right program without utilizing too many resources to begin with? So those are a couple examples. But that's a few ideas. So I'll end there, and I'll hand it over to the next person, maybe Inigo. going to be some infrastructure in the spine setting too for after spine surgery. Still getting it off the ground.
Hello, my name is Inigo San Milan. I work, I'm a physiologist by training, and I work with at the CU Sports Medicine and Performance Center. I'm involved in different areas of research as well as translational research and application. And one of the things that I'm very interested and I've been working quite a bit for the last almost couple of years in cancer metabolism, and where I believe that we can be on the right track for new advancements. So I'll give you a little bit of background. In 1923, German physiologist and Nobel laureate Otto Warburg discovered the process of the first transformation of a normal cell into a cancer cell. So what normal cells do is that, I don't have any pointer here. What normal cells do is that they utilize glucose and they oxidize it through pyruvate in the mitochondria. What Warburg observed is that cancer cells tend to shut down that pathway, and instead of oxidizing pyruvate into the mitochondria, they produce lactate. And that's something that back in the 1920s, lactate was a subject of research by top researchers and different even Nobel Prizes. But everybody concluded that lactate was just a toxic waste product as a result of anaerobic metabolism. So, but Warburg already was onto something about 100 years ago, which is remarkable with that technology. But he couldn't advance more. And upon the arrival of genetics, what happens is that cancer metabolism field was completely buried until recently, because even the discoverer of DNA and one of the father of cancer genetics, James Watson, he's saying now, he's recognizing that it hasn't been remarkably unfruitful to go through cancer genetics to understand cancer. So if he were to do it all over again, he would start by metabolism, and for that, it's necessary to understand in the first place the Warburg effect. So I started to look into the Warburg effect as I hear more and more, and I never heard about it until I read it. And then I said, wow, that was my doctorate thesis. But I did it in skeletal muscle. We don't call it aerobic, Warburg effect. We call it aerobic or cytosolic glycolysis. So, and the skeletal muscle is the largest organ in the body. And it's extremely rare to see cases of skeletal muscle cancer. So that's what I started to see, that the players were identical, except for in skeletal muscle, they were perfectly regulated for the most part. And in cancer, we're very dysregulated. So I started to construct a hypothesis, because it hasn't been explained, the Warburg effect, and using a different perspective. So I spent about eight months working on that without telling anybody, and endless times, endless hours. And finally, when I finished it, I went to my colleague George Brooks from Berkeley, and then he helped me to take it to the finish line, and that's what we call our hypothesis, the lactogenesis hypothesis. So we published in a top-tier cancer journal, Carcinogenesis, and it's been getting a lot of attention. It's so far the 8th most read article in the history of that journal. And so we continue doing this. We believe that we explain the Warburg effect. I'm not going to go through in the detail because there are a lot of elements there. But one of the things, and you can feel free to download the article and go through that. But one of the things that I wanted to keep strengthening this hypothesis, and one of the things, like we all have heard about the oncogenes, and that's been the pretty much entire research in cancer until recently with immunotherapy. But it's about trying to target the oncogenes. So what oncogenes do is they tap or they stimulate, regulate different transcription factors. And those transcription factors are the ones that ultimately keep stimulating the produce of genes and proteins and eventually transform a normal cell into a cancer cell. The main transcription factors in cancer are P53, PIF1, and c-MYC. So I continued with this project, and I said, hey, can we maybe hypothesize, since lactate, one of the things that my colleague George Bruce from Berkeley discovered is that lactate is not a waste product at all. It's a major regulator of many metabolic processes in the body. It's a signaling molecule and has hormone-like properties. So we call it lact hormone. So could lactate, due to the signaling properties, be also act as an oncogene? So for that, I grew some cancer cells, breast cancer cells, and then I exposed them to different concentrations of lactate, 0 millimoles, 5 millimoles, and 10 millimoles. I extracted all the mRNA to look for different transcription factors and other elements. And what I could see, we're preparing the manuscript now, is that in breast cancer cells, when those breast cancer cells are exposed to 20 millimoles of lactate, there's an increase in those transcription factors. This is exactly what we expected. It's not a huge increase, but this is exactly what I expected because breast cancer cells, they grow slowly. It's a slow process of months or even years. If we had a huge increase in these transcription factors, we would see that breast cancer happens overnight or over a week. But that's exactly what we see. So this is the first time that we see that a non-oncogenetic molecule or product, in this case we call it, or I call it the oncometabolite or oncolactate, it has the same properties as the oncogene. So it's opening new doors to understand cancer better and show that it's not just the genes that act on those transcription factors. So with this, I've been building this, strengthening this hypothesis where this is what we've been known for 50 years, and we've been knowing more and more genes now. The oncogenes, what they do, they stimulate or regulate or upregulate those transcription factors, mainly c-MYC, HIF1, and p53, which are the major transcription factors in the majority of cancers. What they do is like they elicit a metabolic reprogramming of cancer cells where they develop the Warburg effect, and that's an exacerbated utilization of glucose and production of lactate. Genetics fields pretty much dies there. They don't continue with what are the other processes in cancer. We're much more because cancer, you need a lot more processes in cancer to continue. Now, what we have seen, what we're observed, what happens is like these cancer cells, eventually they become metabolically dysfunctional because instead of producing 36 moles of ATP, they only produce 4. They produce lactate instead of oxidizing fully the pyruvate. So they become dysfunctional, and eventually the whole organ, as they invade it, the whole organ becomes dysfunctional, eventually causes organ failure. But the Warburg effect only has one byproduct, and that byproduct is lactate. And that's what Warburg observed, but he didn't have the technology we have nowadays. So what we have seen, and that's our publication, that for cancer to continue beyond the first cancer cell or cluster of cancer cells, you need angiogenesis, metastasis, immune escape, and a self-sufficient metabolism. And lactate is the only compound that is not only present in each of these processes, but it's necessary and a mediator and a regulator of these processes. So the next step that we're taking is that with lactate, we have shown that acts as an oncometabolite in the same manner that oncogenes act on the transcription factors. The last thing that we need to prove, in my opinion, and that's what we're now starting to do, is to see if lactate also acts as a signaling molecule for cell division. We know that cancer cells, they replicate very fast, and it's not known why. Obviously, the oncogenes can be part of that, but I believe, and I've been looking at some research, not in cancer, in embryonic cells, for example, they have the similar phenotype as cancer cells, and I think we're on the right track. That's what I hope. So we're going to grow more cancer cells now, and we're going to extract all the expose them to lactate and going to extract the mRNA to look for different genetic expressions of cell division. If we can prove that, we can put together a very good idea of understanding of cancer, and to a level that, in my opinion, that we haven't gotten yet to fully understand cancer, we can hopefully add new doors for new diagnosis and therapeutics. So that's kind of where I'm working in this specific area.
All right, so we're doing quite a few things. I want to just talk about one study that we finished just recently. But just as an overview, basically what we look at is how to optimize physical therapy rehabilitation interventions and how to implement those in clinical practice. And the populations that I've worked with primarily, I've done some work with Dr. Shankman and her Parkinson's exercise research, and with Dr. Stevens Lapsey and the osteoarthritis and total joint. And then I'll talk to you a little bit about what we're doing with post-amputation rehabilitation. So the study that I want to talk about is related to behavior change intervention for patients who have undergone lower limb amputation, specifically for the older adult populations. We focus on working with older adults in rehabilitation, and the majority of those people have what we term dysvascular amputation, so amputation related to complications of diabetes and or PAD. And so my background is actually in exercise science and biomechanics, and we started with some biomechanics, gait, movement pattern questions, but realized that couldn't really do much until we got the patients more active before we could really affect the quality of their movement. They had to be a little bit more mobile. So we developed through a K award, a career development award, that I had a little bit more expertise in management of self-management of behavior, health behavior, and developed a program that we delivered through 12 visits through a telehealth platform with the patient at home, that's basically targeting not just physical activity behavior, although that's what we're doing with the current study, but also managing exercise and health management goals like monitoring blood sugar and those sorts of things. And we ran that for the last couple of years here, and it was a randomized controlled trial, small group. We had 38, so 19 in each group, and the results were such that at the 12-week endpoint, so that's the end of the intervention, we did see, and it was a pilot study, so it wasn't powered for all of these outcomes, but we did see that the big change was in physical activity. So that's why I mentioned that. But you can see their step count. These are average daily step counts. If you look at the middle row there, and we're starting with patients that are 6 months post-amputation. They've gone through and actually completed prosthetic rehabilitation at this point, so their traditional post-amputation course of physical therapy has been completed, and they are at about 1,300 steps a day. And so other than me, when I sit at my office all day, most of us get quite a bit more than that, as you know. And so the interesting thing is we almost doubled that in the intervention group, and not significantly changed in the control group. The control group was just an attention control. We talked to them once a week for 12 weeks and got to know them real well, but didn't really deliver an intervention. And then there was a 3-month non-contact phase in which we didn't have any contact with the participants, and then we came back and tested them at the 6-month point or the 24-week point. And actually what was interesting with this is some of their functional performance measures, like the 2-minute walk and their gait speed, actually began to improve, and their behavior, there was a persistence in their step count remaining high, and then percent time spent in sedentary activity went down. You see a 5% change there. That's fairly significant when you think about the number of minutes a day that is. And then what happened is their light activity increased, their sedentary time went down. And then we had, I think, not real clinically significant, but statistically significant improvement in moderate to vigorous activity. So that's not, and it was all moderate, it wasn't vigorous, by the way. And then the last measure there was a disability assessment scale. So this is a self-report disability scale that we use, the World Health Organization Disability Assessment Scale. And so we're starting to see a trend of decreased disability in the intervention group. So we wrapped up that study and we moved on to some other work. And so as in terms of the spirit of these presentations, collaborations in the department, I've been Bill Sullivan's worked with us for a long time, Ryan Stevenson even longer, And then recently with Noelle So joining the VA, she's a co-investigator on a current project that we're starting. We're moving the project that I just described into a phase 2 trial in which we're submitting an R01 application based on the pilot data that we have, which we're going to try to implement at both UCH and the VA. The VA has the telehealth platform already in place, and UCH is quickly developing that ability, and we've been working with them a little bit on that. And then we currently are doing a similar intervention, actually similar protocol that we piloted and then have moved into a larger clinical trial with the VA merit project that we're doing, and that's for patients who've had total knee arthroplasty. And so in short, people decrease their physical activity behavior with progressive end-stage knee OA for obvious reasons due to pain, but then after the TKA revision, the pain is greatly diminished, the function is greatly improved, the strength is improved, but people still are sedentary. Their physical activity doesn't change from pre to post. And so we're targeting that with this behavioral intervention as well. And so the other people that are involved in our work, we do have fellows. They are research fellows that are involved in our group, and then PhD trainees, DPT students, and research assistants that help us with. So any questions about? We're doing some other things. I just wanted to, I knew the time was short. I wanted to just focus on that one project.
So before I get started, while we're loading it up, it's just that one right there. How many strategically placed? So I thought so I'm going to focus on one particular study, but I'm going to give you just a brief overview, and I think Corey just did a nice job of connecting some of the dots because we work together closely in a number of projects. But this will give you kind of a sense of the scope of some of the things we're doing. A lot of the work that we're doing is fueled by the help of our PhD students in our Rehab Science PhD program, as well as our postdoctoral fellows. We'd love to have the residents more involved in some of our work. Actively involved. So the work that we're doing ranges. There's quite a breadth of the types of things that we're focused on, but all older adult kind of questions related to rehabilitation. So I have a line of research focused on joint arthroplasty, which is probably the one that newer line of research for medically complex patients. Work with medically complex deconditioning to higher level of function. I'll share that. You're able to see the details here, but this represents kind of a lot of our focus is in clinical trials. Models that Corey had just shared with you. Elements of some of the work that is branching into kind of the telehealth arena. Andy Kittleson in our group is working on personalized rehabilitation approaches with analytic models to individualized care. We have a gait lab, so we're looking at mechanisms of movement dysfunction, and Corey is our biomechanist helping out with, or leading the charge with many of those studies. And then a lot of questions that are growing towards the use of wearable technology. So physical activity monitoring and other types of wearable sensors into clinical practice and make them useful. I'm going to focus, though, on just one study right now, or my line of research in medically complex patients. And to set the stage for this in terms of the importance, I think everyone in this room recognizes that deconditioning is a problem with older adults who have been hospitalized. But during hospitalization, older adults spend 83% of their time in bed, 12% of their time in a chair. A lot of getting up and moving around time. And 68% of patients discharged from the hospital are below their pre-hospitalization level of function. So we're not getting them back to their pre-hospitalization levels. And hospitalized older adults are 61 times more likely to develop a disability compared to those who are not hospitalized. And older adults with medical deconditioning have higher rates of readmission and lower rates of discharge to the community. So there's a really important question and a problem that
it's been increasingly shown that there's an inverse relationship between low functional performance and hospital rehabilitation services.
There's a problem with I don't even have to give the presentation. I thought I took all these out, but what I was going to share with you is that the physical function component predicts rehospitalizations more than almost any other predictor out there right now. And so
it's been increasingly shown that there's an inverse relationship.
Sorry, guys. But physical function is, just by itself, aside from comorbidities and other metrics that are related to, that often are associated with rehospitalization, physical function is one of the and what gives us an area to focus on in terms of improvement. The other important piece that I think is worth emphasizing that I bet many in this audience recognize is that our costs in terms of Medicare spending for many services, skilled nursing facilities highlighted here, have continued to increase. So from 2006 to 2015, we saw a 38% increase in the cost of services in skilled nursing facilities. But we didn't see any improvement in outcomes in terms of community discharge rates or rehospitalization. So that's a pretty dramatic investment for no improvement in terms of outcomes. And I think this series of quotes is really interesting, or statistics. When we think about the value of what we're doing and the importance of what we're doing in terms of rehabilitation in older adult populations, function is really important. So when you ask patients what is worse than death, 50% of them will say that they'd rather be dead than not be able to get out of bed. And 40% will say that they'd rather be dead than need care around the clock. And 30% would rather be dead than live in a nursing home. So a lot of our research is designed to counter some of these and really get people more active faster and longer. So we have an opportunity to really truly transform the perception of care in some facility, nursing home types of settings, to a more active, vibrant approach to rehabilitation. And the model that we've been working off of is based on kind of the current rehabilitation paradigm is often focused on many of these general deconditioning activities, foundation of what is done. And at the very top of that pyramid, you see resistance training. And resistance training is a component, but a very small component. And what we've done is we've essentially flipped the pyramid upside down and put resistance training. General conditioning, so that's like walking down the hall or just doing some general kind of movement types of activities, is at the top of the pyramid with the least emphasis. So we're increasing the physiological intensity of the interventions. And what we found in our initial pilot study, which set the stage for two larger clinical trials, is that the patients who received the higher intensity approach in red did much better than the patients who received usual. And what I think is most interesting about this particular data are that the red, so we stopped the intervention at 30 days. So patients following hospitalization, but they continue to improve. And we think that's occurring because we have a trajectory of recovery once they're back in their community and able to interact on a more regular basis on their feet and able to be more independent. They continue to improve their physical performance levels. The same was true, so on the left there's an SPPB score, which is one of our just physical measures as an outcome, and on the right is gait speed. When we look at the same approach that we're using in skilled nursing facilities, what we see is that we're able to decrease the length of stay for managed care patients with a higher intensity approach. We're also able to do that with less total time in treatment. So the idea is not to add more volume to patient care, but to actually be smarter about what we do and provide a higher intensity intervention for these patients in a lesser period of time, which is always attractive in healthcare. So Joel has brought this, Joel Carmichael in the back there has brought this particular slide to my attention, and I think this represents a lot of what we're trying to do. We're trying to take individuals and instead of have a slow decline in terms of physical function, we're trying to allow them to live longer but a better quality of life. So the concept of we can get people to live longer, but if they're living in a nursing home for an extended period of time, are we doing them a service or a disservice? And what we're really looking for is to try and get them back to the levels of physical activity that allow them to engage in sports and activities that they enjoy. So we're out of time, but I want to always thank the group that's responsible for the work, the body of work that we're engaged in. Jason and Allison are two of the PhD students. Bill Sullivan has been instrumental in health study and navigating.
So I stand before you guys pretty, I can safely say that I'm the least published person of all the people that have been up here. And I come to you with ideas. So basically I treated this more as ideas that have been brewing based on my busy clinical practice of observations or things that I've noticed that I think could be translated into a study. So if any of you guys are interested in joining me on any of these projects, I am welcome. These are all like in the beginning phase type projects and just initial thoughts and ideas. So I just wanted to talk you guys through these different potential projects. And I labeled my talk Flight of Ideas because these are all kind of unrelated projects that based on my observation in clinic. So how do we go forward? Okay. So this is, okay. I think I'm out of that. Okay. So. Okay, so I'll just, okay. So the first project comes from my observation in Boulder. I just started doing fluoroscopic procedures in the fluoro suite, and I normally do them down here in the spine center with music. And I did not have music up in Boulder, and I noticed that at least once a day while doing procedures, I had somebody become so dizzy that we had to lay them down, give them 10 to 20 minutes to recover before they were able to be escorted out of the room. So I was used to music down here. I very rarely have this experience with patients in the spine center here. Again, 2 different settings, so there's lots of variables, but I have now implemented music in the fluoro suite up in Boulder, and the rate of orthostatic reactions has plummeted. So I just thought it would be an interesting intervention to see if the environment is influencing patients' experience and potentially influencing whether or not people are getting vasovagal during a procedure. So one of a simple kind of procedure where you, half the fluoro day, you put music on, half you don't, and you just record how many people become orthostatic. So kind of an observational study with slight changes in the environment. So this is a very, I think, doable project. I have talked to a few other faculty members who are interested in participating in this. It's just getting it off the ground, and I know there's been a little bit of work in getting the IRB started. So that's at the very early stages. And then another thing, I'm pretty highly involved in the program planning committee for AA PM&R, so I review all of the submissions for presentation at the annual assembly. And it's been my observation that very few women submit for presentation at the national meetings. And so unfortunately that then results in very few women actually speaking at the meeting. And then I think there's this perception that women aren't being invited or included. And so from a female perspective, I'm actually very disappointed in the number of submissions from women. Granted, I'm in the spine and pain division, so I see those submissions, but I thought it would be really interesting to go through each of the 4 different divisions within AA PM&R and just look at gender representation of submissions, and you could even then look at gender representation of accepted submissions. But I think it would be an interesting project. I've talked to AA PM&R, and they're willing to share the information with me, so it's just a matter of the bandwidth of getting that off the ground. But I thought it would be interesting. And I don't know what I'll find, I just know what my observations have been. But I think that might open up an interesting discussion of potential follow-up surveys of why are women not submitting to talk at national assemblies, to hopefully get to a more equal representation of membership. Okay, so another interest of mine is leadership training, and there's a pretty well-known lack of it in medical schools and graduate education. Really, any residency program has very limited amounts of leadership training as part of their offerings, and ours included. And so I thought it would just be an interesting project to survey PM&R residencies across the country and find out how many hours are spent every year in leadership didactics. Because there's a growing amount of evidence out there that leadership training is essential for physicians, that there may be a link between lack of leadership skills and physician burnout. Because if you don't know how to manage your team, if you don't know how to manage your time, if you don't know how to delegate, you're going to burn out and hate your job. And then so there's kind of an interesting backtrack of at least identifying what's being done now to open up the discussion of what could change. Then I want to turn the stage over a little bit to Adele. I was creating this while I was working with Adele, and she had an idea about back pain and pregnancy, and so.
Yeah, so this is just another idea in its infancy, but back pain and pregnancy is obviously really common and I suspect undertreated. So my initial thoughts were just talking to obstetricians, maybe via survey, and seeing what their opinions on it are, and then potentially doing a retrospective look at how often it's coming into clinic and what is being done. So if they're being sent to PT, obstetricians even know the available treatments for back pain and pregnancy.
That's it. If any of you want to have further discussions about moving any of these forward, or if any of them intrigue you, I'm happy to discuss and help you, and we can work together. That's it.
That's our last.
Hi, so thanks for letting me present today. I've got a few things that are finishing up, a few things that are middle. Hey, Dr. Carmichael. And a few things that are brewing. The one that's brewing that I think is going to come to fruition is looking at the REDCap database over at Children's Hospital that's got kind of a robust and mature concussion program for the utility of MRI as it relates to complicated and multiply concussed kids. There's not a lot of data on this to suggest if ordering MRIs on these kids is useful, meaning that if you've got an athlete or a young person with more than 2 or 3 concussions, is an MRI going to be useful in guiding your clinical care of those folks? And then beyond that is, when do you order MRIs? Loosely, this started with one of the medical students, actually, of looking at my own data, and of the 111 odd MRIs that I had ordered, only about 7 of them had any any abnormalities whatsoever on those 100 MRIs. Of that 7, only one of them was vaguely clinically relevant, but really didn't change practice. So we've discussed this with my partners over at Children's, also with the radiologists, and also with the folks from pediatric sports medicine. So they're all on board with kind of aggregating the data and looking through all of it. So ideally, what we'd be looking for is essentially the number of just, quote, abnormalities found on the MRI divided by the number of MRIs ordered, and then the number of clinically relevant abnormalities on MRI versus the number of MRIs ordered, and then a review of the kind of a retrospective review of the clinical data to determine if there was anything that happened on physical exam or history or some kind of other factor that would help you decide when to order an MRI. So the future direction of this depends on really what we see, and it depends if there's enough grist for the mill to move on from there. But it would be ideally creating some clinical guidelines for when to order MRI in complex concussion, and then secondarily multiply concussed patients. Complex concussion is largely defined as just people that are taking too long to get better, those post-concussive syndrome patients, or patients that are having psychiatric comorbidities that have had other things going on that make the concussion a little bit more difficult. And then ideally, it would be create some recommendations to potentially stop ordering so many MRIs in concussion and multiply concussed athletes. This is becoming a really, I talked about this at Gersten Day, but when you multiply these concussions over one institution over multiple years and you multiply that by multiple institutions, this is an incredibly costly thing that we're doing with really, really questionable utility right now. The second one that's bigger but potentially more important, I think, long term, as many of you know, there's a University of Colorado Hospital Concussion Institute now with us, neurology, neurosurgery, physical therapy, speech therapy, neuropsychology, and family practice sports. And what we're looking at doing is creating a similar database to what Children's Hospital has so that we can retrospectively look at the people that we're enrolling into our program. It's up and running clinically. I think we've seen about 75 to 80 patients over the course of the last 8 months. We'd like to proactively create that database before our hair catches on fire and we don't have the time or bandwidth to do so. That database exists at Children's Hospital, so we'd be using that as a starting point for what we'd like. But as many of you know, there's relatively limited data around civilian, meaning non-military folks and people that are not involved in a workers' compensation environment and folks that are non-athletes. Like, we know those populations fairly well because they're reasonably closed systems, but in a civilian motor vehicle accident population, we know less about them unless they come from a workers' compensation scenario. So in the beginning, this is going to be epidemiologic data, but we certainly could expand it to outcomes under certain circumstances. As you know, the IRB would allow us to collect the data, and then you can dive into it for epidemiologic kind of non-identified information. But if you really wanted to drill down beyond that, you'd have to create some different IRBs. Future directions for this, we'd like this to be, myself and the other directors of the program would like this to be big and useful. So big and useful requires some dollars and it requires some effort. So we're looking at some creative ways to fund this through the multiple departments that are involved and potentially getting some grant funding to lay the foundation for this. And then we like to partner with some other similar programs and institutions. As many of you know, I worked at University of Washington. They have a really big program now that's largely donor funded. So we'd like to generate some ideas from them. And then in Venu's ideas, some of the projects that have recently been completed or in the process of completing, Dr. Miron and McMullen published epidemiologic of cervical spine injuries in high school athletes over a 10-year period. This is from the high school RIO database that Dawn Comstock and her group has ownership of. And then Dr. Coward and Nurki are in the process of completing the relationship of overuse injury and extrascholastic sports participation in high school athletes over an 8-year period. So we've got the statistics, and now we're just gussy it up a little bit for publication. A couple other ones, the last two are case presentations that we kind of morphed into some clinical review. I think these are probably more appropriate for the PGY 2s and 3s. They probably become less relevant for you guys as you move into the end of your 3. But Drs. Meyer and Miedema did some cervical metastases work and diastomatomyelia with Dr. Lurston last year, I believe, and there's one that we're considering now for spine as well. And then I've worked with Dr. Brenner on some Grandview concussion data, and then we are in the process of completing the department's grant-funded project that was on the parental understanding of concussion, or parental attitudes around concussion. So that's completed. The data's all done. We ended up with 50 of the quantitative surveys, and I want to say 17 or 18 of the qualitative surveys. So now we're just grinding through that data to determine what we'll publish on, because there's there were a lot of questions on that. That about sum it up, Lisa? A lot of questions in there?
A lot of questions, a lot of data.
Nazi was also involved in that project as well. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have, and I'm also happy to field any areas of interest that you have in the future. The last one, I'm the one stopping you from seeing your kids. So.
One more person.
Sorry, I'll be so fast. I'm not talking about my research, but I'm talking about veterans. So we'll play a game while I'm walking up. How many veterans in the U.S.? How many vets in the United States? Do you know?
2 million?
2 million veterans. How many? Okay, higher or lower?
Higher.
Higher. How many? This is between you and Lee. How many? 5 million. Higher or lower? Higher. Higher. How many? We're going to keep going.
Too many.
7 million. 17. Higher or lower?
Higher.
Higher. 20. Higher or lower? Higher. 22. 23 million veterans in the U.S. Okay? Out of those veterans, there's one cohort that uses the VA the most. They all, Vietnam veterans, blah, blah, blah. One cohort uses it the most. Which cohort is it?
Vietnam. What war?
What war, sure. What cohort? Vietnam, Korean, not World War II anymore.
Afghanistan.
Vietnam.
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. What percentage of them is carried in the air? 80 is lower. 80 would be amazing. 50 higher. Okay, so 23 million people, and in at least that one cohort, about 60% of them seek care in the VA. So you can see that this is really very big data. And I never know how to use this up here. Okay. So, and you may know who's working for the VA. Almost everybody raise your hand. Yes, awesome. Do you know that we're coming here in August, too? VA maintains patient health care and administrative data that can be used by researchers, which is all of you. You can use it to prepare for research. So if you're interested in a project, let's say you're a spine guy or gal, and you want to know how many people in the entire VA have gotten a kind of intervention that you're interested in, you can do preparatory research to see what numbers you're working with. You can do secondary data analysis. And so secondary data analysis just means you can use the VA medical records, the data in it, to do research. And you can do recruitment based on a diagnosis. So we use this data, we use the VA data all the time to pinpoint individuals that we want to send letters to participate in our research. There's a very specific way to request data. It's called the Data Access Request Tracker, DART. You need IRB approval in place to do this, but once you have IRB approval in place, the people on the MyRec data team, raise your hands. There they are. They're amazing. Jerry Forster, who's also your department statistician. Raise your hand, Jerry, because not everybody gets to see you all the time. Yay, Jerry. And Claire Hoffmeyer, who is an epidemiologist and is also working on meta-analytic things for the department. Their team, not they, will help you fill out these DART paperwork if you need help. And that there's something inside the VA called the VA Informatics and Computing Infrastructure. It's called Vinci. It's a platform inside VA that you can use and work with data in there. It also has computing software and tools that you need to do it, like SPSS and other things. All the data comes out of something called the VA Corporate Data Warehouse. CDW is how we talk about it. It's a relational database that contains national data from all veterans who seek care. It also has data about care, so choice. You might have heard about choice. Who's heard about choice? So this is good care that VA is paying for, so you can find out about choice, care in the community. It comes from, just so you know, there's an emergency alert. Emergencies, please call 911. Data comes from clinical care records and financial records, so if you're a money person, you can also get that data. There's demographics, although not perfect in some of the realms that we would like to know about. We're trying to catch up with diversity, and there's challenges around asking people inside the government what race and ethnicity they are. We're trying to work around that. Patient demographics, as I said, inpatient, outpatient visits, how much care was purchased, ICD-9-10 codes, pharmacy is particularly good data, and blood work and labs. Knowing how to pull this data, which our data team does, is key, but all this data is available and available to you. There's also specialized data sets like the Suicide Data Repository that includes all national death index data. So we're interested in suicide in particular, but this has how everybody died, every veteran ever. And there's data sets that are specific to OEF, OIF, and OND veterans. That's the younger cohort. And there's also veterans benefit data, so you can see who's getting disability, how that might impact their care, things like that. I know several folks, raise your hands if you're going to be working with me on the suicide and CVA project. Raise your hand. 1, 2, there's one, and somebody else. So we've pulled down all the data for everybody who has died by suicide in the VA that has a CVA. So we have a huge data set, and we can look at rates of death, and we have a control cohort too. We've actually pulled that data down for ALS, Huntington's, CVA, I can't remember all of them. MS, I said, yeah. So if you have any interest in any of those neurologic conditions, I have huge data sets that probably can get published in a very good journal if you want to come look at charts. And I'm happy to talk about other VA data research with any of you. So thanks and good night.
So Laker, you would have loved this. I was talking to a hockey family the other day, and they're like, "Yeah, it's pretty bad condition." And we went to this, and they had this like meter, and it held it here, and it's this whole balance thing. And I was like, "Oh, who'd they take him to?" I guess a chiropractor. Yeah, I was like, it's not a I was controlling.